August 9, 378 AD. Late afternoon. The sun over the Thracian plain had turned the color of blood. Somewhere in the smoke and chaos of a battlefield that had once held the full strength of Rome's Eastern Field Army. Somewhere among the thousands of men who had marched out of the city of Adrianople. That same morning with their shields polished, as their standards rose, the Eastern Emperor of the Roman Empire, Flavius Julius Valens Augustus, was dying. Or perhaps already dead. No one knew. No one would ever know for certain. What the survivors remembered, in the years and decades that followed, was the smell, iron and ash, the particular sweetness of burning grain, and beneath it all, the unmistakable heaviness of death on a scale that few human beings in any century have ever been forced to witness. They remembered the screaming that eventually stopped. They remembered the silence afterward, which was somehow worse. Ammianus Marcellinus, the greatest military historian of the late Roman world, a Syrian-born Roman officer who had himself survived battlefield carnage across the eastern frontier and written about it with unflinching precision in his monumental work The Res Gestae, called What Happened on That Day, the worst disaster to befall Rome since the Battle of Cannae, 600 years before. He wrote those words not as hyperbole, not as the rhetorical flourish of a man reaching for dramatic effect. He wrote them as a man who had done the accounting, who had looked at the numbers and the names and the empty spaces where units and commanders used to be, and could not make the calculation come out any other way. 2/3 of Rome's Eastern Field Army died in a single afternoon. Senior commanders, men whose names filled the pages of imperial records, men who had spent their careers climbing the difficult ladder of Roman military advancement, were found among the dead. The general Trajanus fell. Sebastian, who had spent years patiently reorganizing Roman frontier forces in the Balkans, and who had believed, with the particular confidence of a man who understood his enemy, that he had made them better and more capable, fell. Valerian and Aquitius, both senior officers of long standing, whose experience represented decades of institutional knowledge, fell. The list went on, and the men doing the counting, the survivors, who would have to ride back to Constantinople and stand before whoever remained in authority, and explain what had happened to Rome's finest military force, could barely bring themselves to finish it. But it was the emperor himself whose fate eclipsed everything else. Flavius Valens had retreated from the main carnage of the battlefield, wounded, and his surviving bodyguard had brought him to a farmhouse near the edge of the fighting. A solid stone building of the kind that dotted the Thracian countryside. The kind of building that in ordinary times would have belonged to a farmer growing grain or raising cattle, indifferent to the great events of empire. The Goths, who had not yet realized they were in proximity to the Emperor of Rome, set the house on fire. One account, preserved by Ammianus Marcellinus in the Res Gestae, suggests that a single attendant escaped through a window and lived to tell the story, and that it was through this man's testimony, extracted by his Gothic captors and eventually transmitted back to Roman sources, that the world learned what had happened in that building. Another account, offered years later by the historian Zosimus, drawing on the earlier work of Eunapius, claims that Valens died fighting in the open field, his body trampled and lost beneath the weight of the dead, before any retreat to any farmhouse occurred. A third tradition, recorded by the ecclesiastical historian Sozomen, holds that he was never wounded at all, but simply vanished into the chaos of the collapsing battle, his identity unknown to the enemies who killed him. What all three accounts agree on, what every source that touches this subject agrees on without exception or qualification, is this: the body of the Roman emperor was never recovered. No funeral was held, no tomb was built, no inscription was carved to mark his passing. The man who had ruled the Eastern Empire for 14 years, who had commanded armies from the Persian frontier to the Danube, who had issued laws and reorganized provinces and corresponded with bishops about the finer points of Christian theology, with the obsessive intensity of a man who believed these questions mattered more than almost anything else, simply ceased to exist on a summer afternoon in Thrace, and left behind nothing but a name and a catastrophe. Rome had lost emperors before. Decius had died fighting the Goths at the Battle of Adrianople in 251 AD. The first emperor to fall in battle against a foreign enemy, and that had been devastating enough. But Decius had left a body. His soldiers knew where he fell. There had been mourning and ceremony, and the machinery of imperial succession had ground forward with the grim efficiency that Rome had developed over centuries of crisis. With Valens, there was none of that. There was only the fire, and the smoke, and the silence of the Thracian plain. In the long, terrible evening after the battle ended, the question that has haunted historians for 16 centuries is not simply how Rome lost that battle. Battles are lost. Even the greatest armies in human history have had their bad days, their moments of catastrophic miscalculation and irreversible failure. The question that matters, the question that gets to the heart of what Adrianople actually was, and what it actually meant, is how Rome allowed itself to arrive at that moment. How a civilization that had spent 800 years perfecting the art of war, that had absorbed defeat after defeat and always come back stronger, walked into a catastrophe of its own, making on a dusty plain in Thrace and never fully walked back out. The answer begins not on a battlefield. It begins on the banks of a river, 2 years earlier. On a series of desperate days when hundreds of thousands of human beings stood on the northern shore of the Danube and begged to be let in. It begins with people who had lost everything, and an empire that saw in their desperation not a human crisis requiring a human response, but an opportunity too good to pass up. This is the story of the Battle of Adrianople. But more than that, it is the story of what happens when an empire mistakes desperation for weakness, and cruelty for strength. It is the story of a system that had worked for centuries, beginning slowly and then, all at once, to fail. It is the story of a single afternoon that ended one world, and quietly, irrevocably, began another. To understand why hundreds of thousands of people abandoned everything they had ever known, every farm and village and ancestral burial ground and accumulated possession of generations, and threw themselves on the mercy of an empire that did not particularly want them. You have to understand what they were running from. And what they were running from was unlike anything the ancient world had ever seen. The Huns first appear in Roman sources in the early 370s AD. Emerging from the vast grasslands north of the Caspian Sea and the Pontic steppe like something the ancient world had no existing category for. The language that Roman writers used to describe them is striking precisely because these were not men who frightened easily. Roman officers and administrators were professionals who dealt with military threats as a matter of routine, men who had spent their careers on dangerous frontiers and learned to assess enemies with the cold clarity of long experience. And yet when these men wrote about the Huns, the language shifted. Something changed in the register of their prose. Ammianus Marcellinus, who had campaigned on the eastern frontier and seen combat firsthand, who had survived the catastrophic siege of Amida in 359 AD and written about it without self-pity or theatrical embellishment, described the Huns in terms that border on the ethnographic fantastic. He wrote that they seemed barely to touch the ground, that they lived on horseback to a degree that seemed to blur the boundary between rider and animal. Sleeping on horseback, negotiating on horseback, eating and drinking on horseback. He wrote that they cooked their meat not over fires, but by placing it between their thighs and the flanks of their horses as they rode, using body heat as their only preparation. He described their faces as disfigured in infancy by deliberate scarring designed to prevent beard growth, giving them an appearance that struck Mediterranean observers as deeply alien. Modern historians are right to point out that much of this description reflects Roman cultural bias as much as observable military reality. The Huns were not subhuman, and Ammianus's more lurid passages tell us as much about Roman anxieties and ethnographic conventions as they do about the actual Huns. They were a sophisticated nomadic confederation with complex internal politics, remarkable metalworking traditions that archaeology has confirmed were of very high quality, and a military system of genuinely extraordinary effectiveness. But the fear that Roman writers expressed when describing them was real, and it was shared without exception by every settled agricultural people who encountered them. The Huns fought in a way that the existing military doctrine of the ancient world had no clean answer for. Their primary weapon was the composite recurve bow, a masterpiece of engineering constructed from carefully selected and shaped layers of wood, bone, and sinew, compressed and bound together in configurations that took years to complete, and that could be compressed during manufacture and then released with devastating stored energy. A skilled Hun archer, firing from horseback at full gallop, could put an arrow through a man at distances that infantry archers could barely reach standing still with a simple wooden bow. The accuracy and rate of fire that Hun warriors achieved through a lifetime of practice from childhood was extraordinary by the standards of any contemporary military force, and crucially, they did not stand and fight in the way that ancient military doctrine assumed an enemy would stand and fight. They wheeled and circled and harassed and pulled back, and if you chased them, they led you somewhere unpleasant and then turned around. If you refused to chase them, they kept shooting until your formation broke or your casualties mounted to the point where holding your ground became impossible. The Roman legionary system, built around the disciplined advance of heavy infantry in tight formation, holding shields as a wall and using short swords in the grinding close-quarters work of pushing and stabbing, had spent centuries developing answers to every kind of enemy it had encountered. It had no clean answer for an enemy who would not come close enough to be reached. By roughly 370 AD, the Huns had crossed the Volga River and begun pushing westward with a momentum that appeared, to the peoples in their path, essentially unstoppable. The Alans, Iranian-speaking nomadic pastoralists of the steppe who were themselves formidable warriors with long traditions of mounted warfare, encountered the Huns first and could not stop them. Some Alan groups were absorbed into the expanding Hun confederation, fighting alongside them as allied cavalry. Others fled westward, adding their own displacement to the growing wave of population movement that was beginning to build across the entire chain of peoples living between the Volga and the Danube. The Ostrogoths, the eastern branch of the Gothic people, were the next to feel the full weight of the Hunnic advance. Their king, Ermaneric, was by all accounts an old man by this point in the 370s, legendary among his own people for decades of successful rule over a vast territory that Gothic tradition and the later historian Jordanes both claimed stretched from the Baltic to the Black Sea. A claim that modern archaeologists treat with caution but that reflects the genuine scale of Ostrogothic political authority in the region. When the Huns came, Ermaneric had no effective answer for them. The ancient sources diverge on the precise manner of his end. Ammianus records that he died from wounds sustained in the fighting, a warrior's death in the field. Jordanes, writing in the 6th century and drawing on Gothic oral tradition through the now lost history of Cassiodorus, records a different story. One in which the old king died by his own hand rather than face the humiliation of submission to the Huns. Both versions may reflect genuine traditions. What is certain is the political result: the Ostrogothic kingdom collapsed, its people scattered, absorbed, or subjugated. Now the pressure fell directly on the Visigoths, the Western Goths, who occupied the territory. Roughly corresponding to modern Romania, the land between the arc of the Carpathian Mountains and the wide course of the Danube River. Their situation in the mid-370s was acute in a way that left very little room for strategic options. To the north and east, the Huns were coming, and nothing had stopped them. To the south, beyond the Danube, lay Roman territory. The Visigoths had lived in a complex relationship with the Roman Empire for generations. They had raided it, fought it, traded with it, concluded treaties with it, and served in its armies as individual volunteers. Many had converted to Christianity through the extraordinary missionary work of Bishop Ulfilas, who had spent decades among the Gothic people and had famously translated the Bible into the Gothic language, creating a Gothic alphabet for the purpose, a cultural achievement whose significance extended far beyond its immediate religious purpose. The Goths were not strangers to Rome, but they had never, in all of that complicated history, asked Rome for what they were about to ask. The leader who emerged to navigate this existential crisis was a man named Fritigern. His personal history before the great events of 376 AD is largely invisible to us, the sources providing no biography before the crisis itself. But what the evidence shows, assembled from scattered references across multiple sources, is a man of considerable political intelligence and pragmatic flexibility. He had converted to Christianity, at least in part as a calculated step to improve his political standing with Roman authorities. He had navigated previous conflicts with neighboring Gothic leaders with enough skill to maintain and consolidate his position. He understood, as the crisis deepened, that the Huns could not be fought effectively with the resources the Visigoths had available. The Ostrogoths had tried and failed. The Alans had tried and failed. The only viable path was negotiation, and the only negotiating partner with the power to offer genuine safety was Rome. In the summer of 376 AD, Fritigern sent emissaries across the Danube to the court of Emperor Valens, who was at that time based at Antioch, managing the perpetually complicated situation on the Persian frontier where Roman and Sasanian interests had been in tension for generations. The message that the Gothic ambassadors carried was straightforward, and its terms, viewed from the Roman perspective, must have seemed almost too convenient to be entirely real. The Visigoths requested permission to cross the Danube and settle within Roman territory, specifically in the provinces of the lower Danube frontier. In exchange for this permission, they offered military service. They would become soldiers of Rome, fighting under Roman command structures, defending Roman frontiers against external threats. They asked for land sufficient to support their community and safety from the Hunnic advance. They asked, in the fundamental terms of the offer, to become part of Rome. Valens consulted his advisors. The debate that followed, reconstructed from later sources that preserve its outlines, if not its precise words, involved genuine disagreement among men with different assessments of the risks and opportunities involved. Some voices urged caution, pointing to the sheer scale of the Gothic population gathered on the northern bank and the logistical impossibility of absorbing such numbers smoothly into provincial life. The estimates being discussed were enormous. Ancient sources offer figures ranging across a very wide spectrum, and modern historians, applying demographic analysis and comparative evidence, generally estimate the total Visigothic population, seeking entry at somewhere between 100,000 and 200,000 people, with a substantial proportion being warriors of military age. That was not a small group of asylum seekers. That was a migration that would permanently alter the character of the Balkan provinces. But the voices urging caution did not carry the day. The voices that won the argument were pointing to something more immediately compelling to an emperor managing an overstretched military establishment. The Roman army needed soldiers, and here were soldiers offering themselves. The Eastern Empire under Valens was militarily stretched in ways that were becoming structurally difficult to manage. The Persian frontier demanded constant resources and attention. The Danube frontier, 1,500 miles of river boundary requiring continuous garrisoning, absorbed enormous manpower. Recruiting sufficient Roman citizens to fill all the roles the army needed had become increasingly difficult and increasingly expensive. And here, on the northern bank of the Danube, was an apparently unlimited supply of men who already knew how to fight, who were offering to serve in exchange for land and security. Ammianus records that Roman officials around Valens celebrated the arrangement as though it were a gift of extraordinary good fortune. Speaking of an inexhaustible river of recruits flowing into Roman service, some sources also suggest that Valens anticipated the tax revenue that would come from settling productive farming communities on Thracian land that had been depopulated by previous decades of conflict and instability. The permission was granted. The crossing of the Danube could begin. What followed was the largest single organized movement of people across the Danube in the recorded history of the frontier. Roman boats worked the river around the clock, ferrying Gothic families and their possessions from the northern bank to the southern. The scale of the operation immediately overwhelmed the administrative capacity of the Roman frontier system. There were not enough boats to move people quickly enough to prevent dangerous overcrowding on the northern bank. There were not enough Roman officials to register, document, and process the incoming population in any organized fashion. There was no coherent plan for receiving hundreds of thousands of people, directing them to designated settlement areas, and providing adequate food during the transition. And there was no effective enforcement of the agreement that the Visigoths were supposed to surrender their weapons as a condition of crossing. This last failure would prove, of all the many failures of the Gothic crossing operation, to be by far the most consequential. The men directly responsible for managing the crossing were the Roman commanders Lupicinus and Maximus, both of whom were, by every ancient account that touches on their conduct, deeply and aggressively corrupt, men who understood the Gothic crisis primarily as a business opportunity of exceptional scale. They accepted bribes to allow Gothic warriors to cross while keeping their weapons, rendering meaningless the one security measure that the agreement had included. They used their control over the food supply to conduct transactions that Ammianus describes with the specific outrage of a man who has heard these details from reliable sources, and finds them genuinely beyond the ordinary range of Roman administrative venality. Gothic families, separated from their own food resources during the chaotic crossing process, were forced to purchase food from Roman suppliers at prices set by men with a monopoly and no restraint. When money ran out, which it did quickly, the Roman administrators accepted other forms of payment. Ammianus records, with the flat precision of a man reporting documented fact, that Gothic people sold their children into slavery in exchange for food, with the going rate at one point apparently reaching a dog per child. Roman merchants providing dog meat as the commodity and taking Gothic children as the price. By the time the last of the Visigoths had completed the crossing and been joined on Roman soil by a smaller and unauthorized group of Ostrogoths who crossed separately in the chaos, the situation had already developed characteristics that any experienced administrator could have recognized as explosive. Hundreds of thousands of armed, hungry, deeply angry people were encamped on Roman soil, being administered by officials who were stealing from them openly and without apparent concern for consequences. With no functioning plan for their permanent resettlement and no meaningful Roman military force in the immediate region capable of imposing order if the situation deteriorated further. The situation was already deteriorating. The detonator had been lit. The only remaining question was how long it would burn before it reached the charge. The betrayal did not announce itself dramatically. It accumulated, as betrayals of this kind usually do, through a series of small decisions made by small men in positions of temporary power over people who had no recourse and no alternatives. Lupicinus and Maximus had been given one of the most consequential administrative assignments in the recent history of the eastern frontier. The safe, orderly, and humane processing of the Gothic crossing was not merely a logistical task. It was a political act of enormous long-term significance. The agreement between Valens and Fritigern was, in its fundamental architecture, reasonable and potentially workable. Rome genuinely needed soldiers. The Goths genuinely needed safety. The exchange of military service for land and security had precedent in Roman frontier policy going back generations. If the crossing had been managed competently and honestly, if the Goths had arrived on Roman soil, fed, registered, directed to viable settlement areas, and treated as the recruits and settlers the agreement described, the history of the next century might have been substantially different. Lupicinus and Maximus looked at this situation and saw a market. The weapons surrender was the first and most catastrophic failure. The agreement explicitly required Gothic warriors to give up their arms before crossing, and this was not merely a bureaucratic condition. It was the single security measure that made the entire arrangement viable from Rome's perspective. Without it, Rome was not receiving settlers and soldiers. It was receiving an armed people, with its own military leadership structure and its own reasons for anger, inside Roman territory. The enforcement of the weapons surrender required consistency, determination, and a willingness to delay the crossing process to ensure compliance. Lupicinus and Maximus found that Gothic warriors were willing to pay, in coin, in goods, in whatever they had, to keep their weapons. The administrators took the payments and waved the armed men through. The food supply became the second instrument of exploitation. The Gothic community on the southern bank of the Danube was dependent on Roman administrative goodwill for its food during the transition period before permanent settlement could be arranged. Lupicinus and Maximus controlled this supply and used it with the systematic thoroughness of men who understood leverage. Prices were set at levels that stripped Gothic families of their resources within days. When money was gone, goods were accepted. When goods were gone, the transactions that Ammianus describes with such precise horror became the operating reality of the Gothic crossing zone. Children exchanged for food, families fragmented, the dignity of an entire people systematically stripped away in exchange for the necessities of survival. The Gothic warriors who had crossed with their weapons watched this happen. They were men who had fought the Huns, who had decided to seek a new life within Rome's borders rather than die on the steppe, who had followed their leaders across the great river in good faith based on an agreement that Roman officials were violating systematically and openly. The anger that built in the Gothic encampments south of the Danube during the months following the crossing was not the hot anger of a sudden insult. It was the cold, accumulating anger of people who have been shown, repeatedly and unmistakably, that the power above them considers their lives and their children and their dignity to be resources to be extracted rather than things to be respected. Fritigern watched this and managed his community's response with the political skill that had brought him this far. He was not a reckless man. He understood that a premature confrontation, before the Gothic community had recovered from the exhaustion of the crossing and the chaos of the immediate transition, would be catastrophic. He continued to negotiate, to send complaints through Roman channels, to maintain the formal posture of a leader committed to the agreement his people had made. But he was also watching the weapons his warriors had kept, and he was watching the Roman military presence in the region, which was thin, and he was calculating. The detonator that Lupicinus provided came in the form of an invitation. In the spring or early summer of 377 AD, Lupicinus arranged a formal banquet at his headquarters, apparently at or near the town of Adrianople, and invited Fritigern and several other Gothic leaders to attend. The stated purpose was diplomatic, an occasion for the Roman commander to meet formally with the Gothic leadership, perhaps to discuss the ongoing issues of settlement and supply. The actual purpose, as the events immediately following make clear, was something else entirely. Lupicinus had decided to resolve the Gothic problem through its leadership, and a dinner invitation was the mechanism he had chosen. The details of what happened that evening are preserved primarily in Ammianus, and they carry the specific texture of events reported by survivors rather than invented by a historian reaching for drama. The Gothic leaders arrived at the Roman headquarters and were received with the surface hospitality of a formal Roman military dinner. Wine and food in a building that represented the full weight of Roman administrative authority. Outside the building, in the street, the Gothic bodyguards who had accompanied their leaders waited. At some point during the evening, the sounds of violence from the street reached the dining room. Lupicinus had ordered the Gothic bodyguards killed. The men inside heard it, or heard enough of it to understand what was happening, and the Gothic leaders in the room with Lupicinus faced, in the space of a few seconds, the kind of decision that defines a person's entire subsequent history. Fritigern did not freeze and did not panic. He spoke to Lupicinus with the controlled calm of a man who has decided precisely what he is going to do and is buying himself the seconds he needs to do it. He told the Roman commander, according to the tradition preserved in Ammianus, that he would go outside and calm his men, that the violence in the street could be ended if he were allowed to address the Gothic bodyguards personally. Lupicinus, apparently uncertain enough in that moment to allow it, let him go. Fritigern walked out of that building and did not stop walking. He found a horse, and he left, and he did not return to Roman custody or to Roman negotiation for the remaining years of the crisis. The diplomat was gone. What replaced him, that night and in the weeks immediately following, was something Rome had created through its own conduct and would now have to face. The rebellion that began in the hours and days after the Adrianople banquet was not a spontaneous eruption of disorganized violence. It was the response of a community that had been armed, that had military leadership in place, that had accumulated grievances sufficient to have destroyed any patience for further accommodation, and that now understood, with the clarity that the murder attempt at the banquet provided, that continued negotiation was not a realistic path. Gothic warriors across the encampments south of the Danube took up the weapons they had never surrendered. Fritigern sent riders to every Gothic group he could reach, including the Ostrogothic groups that had crossed separately and were encamped in the region. He reached out to other people who had reason to resent Roman authority in the Balkans, including some Alan groups and even some disaffected Roman slaves and agricultural workers in the Thracian countryside who joined the growing movement. What Rome had created, through the corruption of Lupicinus and Maximus, and the chain of decisions that had led to the Marcianople banquet, was not a barbarian raiding party that could be dispersed with a show of military force. It was an insurgency with deep roots in legitimate grievance, competent military leadership, substantial numbers of armed and experienced warriors, and the enormous tactical advantage of operating inside Roman territory against a Roman military presence that was too thin and too poorly positioned to contain it. Lupicinus moved to suppress the rebellion with the forces he had available, which were inadequate. The engagement that followed, somewhere in the vicinity of Marcianople, ended badly for the Romans. Lupicinus retreated. The Gothic force, emboldened by its first success against Roman military opposition, began moving through the Thracian countryside with a freedom that the Roman defensive posture could not effectively constrain. The raiding that followed through the summer and autumn of 377 AD was extensive and damaging. Gothic groups moved through Thrace, Moesia, and into Macedonia, burning farms, disrupting the agricultural systems that fed both the civilian population and the military garrisons, taking livestock and supplies. The Roman response was reactive and piecemeal, commanders responding to reports of Gothic activity in one area while Gothic forces moved to another. The frontier province of Thrace, which had been one of the most productive agricultural regions of the Eastern Empire, began to empty of its civilian population as farmers and villagers abandoned their land and moved south toward the relative safety of walled towns and the Aegean coast. The general Sebastian was the first Roman commander to develop an approach that showed genuine effectiveness against the Gothic insurgency. Operating with a smaller, more mobile force rather than attempting to mass the available Roman troops into a single large army that the Goths could simply avoid, Sebastian conducted a series of raids on Gothic supply caches and encampments that denied the Gothic force the accumulated stores it needed to sustain itself through the winter. His successes were real, and they were noticed, both by the Romans, who reported them to the emperor, and by the Gothic leadership who recognized in Sebastian an opponent of a different quality from Lupicinus. But Sebastian's successes, significant as they were tactically, could not resolve the strategic problem. The Gothic force was still there. It was still armed. Fritigern was still leading it with the careful patience of a man who understood that time. And the Thracian winter and Roman administrative dysfunction were all working in his favor. And in Constantinople, the emperor who had made the decision that created this entire situation was beginning to understand that he would have to deal with it personally. Valens left Antioch for Constantinople in the spring of 378 AD. The Eastern Field Army was coming with him. The moment of confrontation that Lupicinus's corruption had made inevitable was approaching. And with it, the day on the Thracian plain that would change the shape of everything that came after. There is a particular kind of blindness that power creates, and Flavius Valens had been living inside it for 14 years. He had come to the throne in 364 AD, appointed co-emperor by his older brother Valentinian I, who took the Western Empire for himself and left Valens the East. It was not, by any honest measure, an equal division. The West had Italy, the symbolic heart of Roman civilization, the old senatorial aristocracy with its thousand-year memory of republican dignity, the prestige of a city whose name had become synonymous with the idea of civilization itself. The East had Constantinople, magnificent and growing, and it had the Danube frontier with its perpetual restlessness. And it had the eternally complicated Persian border where Roman and Sasanian Persian interests had been grinding against each other for generations. And it had a theological controversy so bitter and so deeply personal that it had split the Christian church into factions that could not occupy the same room without reaching for weapons. The controversy was Arianism, the question of whether Christ was of the same substance as God. The Father, consubstantial as the Council of Nicaea had declared in 325 AD, or merely similar in substance, as the Arian position maintained. To modern ears, accustomed to thinking of theological disputes as matters that reasonable people can defer to private conscience, this may sound like the kind of disagreement that could be set aside in the interest of practical governance. To the Romans of the 4th century, it was the question on which the eternal fate of every soul depended, and the man who held the wrong answer was not merely mistaken, but actively dangerous to the spiritual welfare of everyone under his authority. Valens was an Arian Christian, and he had spent years of his reign pursuing that conviction with the systematic thoroughness that was characteristic of his personality. Bishops who refused to accept the Arian formulation had been exiled. Clergy had been harassed and displaced. Communities had been torn apart along theological lines that cut across every other social boundary. Valens was not a man who handled disagreement with equanimity, and the theological controversy of his reign had given his capacity for intolerance an enormous and consequential stage on which to operate. He was also, and this is the fact that matters most for understanding what happened in the summer of 378 AD, a man of acute sensitivity to his own reputation, and of an almost physical discomfort with comparisons that did not favor him. His nephew, the Western Emperor Gratian, was 18 years old in 378 AD, the son of Valentinian I and co-ruler of the Western Empire since his father died in 375. 18 years old, and already he was everything that Valens, at 50, was not and could not become. Gratian was young, which in the Roman political imagination carried an almost automatic association with energy and promise. He was classically educated in the tradition that the old Roman aristocracy still valued above almost everything else. Fluent in the literature and rhetoric that defined a cultivated Roman gentleman. He was personally brave and a fine soldier, attributes that the Roman military establishment respected above all others. And earlier that same summer of 378, he had achieved something that Romans across the empire were still talking about with the particular satisfaction of people who had been given a story they needed. Near the Rhine frontier, in the engagement at Argentaria in what is now the Alsace region of France, Gratian had met an Alemanni invasion force of considerable size and had shattered it with tactics that veterans described as elegant and decisive. The victory had been complete, the personal conduct of the young emperor exemplary, the political message unmistakable. Dispatches celebrating the outcome had traveled across the empire, and the name of Gratian was on every educated Roman's lips. He was, in that summer, the story of Rome's military resurgence, the young emperor who had proven himself. Valens, in Constantinople, read those dispatches. He was 50 years old, and he had spent 2 years failing to resolve a Gothic crisis that his own decision had created. He had marched against the Goths before, in the campaigns of 377, and those campaigns had produced nothing clean or conclusive. Fritigern and the Gothic leadership had demonstrated a frustrating mastery of the kind of warfare that the Thracian countryside favored. Avoiding pitched engagements against Roman concentrations while raiding freely through the agricultural landscape that Roman garrisons were supposed to protect. Roman forces had won individual engagements, had burned Gothic camps, had driven Gothic groups from particular areas, but nothing had been decisive. The Goths were still there. The raiding continued. Thrace was devastated, and in Constantinople, and across the Eastern Empire, people were aware that the crisis persisted. By the spring of 378, Valens had made his decision. He would deal with this himself, in person, at the head of the main Eastern Field Army. He marched from Antioch to Constantinople, arriving at the end of May, and continued west through the Balkan provinces toward Adrianople, the principal Roman administrative center of Thrace and the natural staging point for a major offensive north of the Balkan mountain range. He arrived at Adrianople in late July 378 and established his headquarters there, and then he waited. Because Gratian was coming. The young Western Emperor had sent word that he was bringing his victorious army east to combine forces with his uncle for the Gothic campaign. His march through the Western Balkan provinces was underway, delayed by a skirmish with a group of Alans near the Danube that had required his attention. But his dispatches confirmed that he was moving and that he would arrive within weeks. The military logic of the situation, logic that any experienced commander could have articulated without being asked, said that waiting was not merely the cautious option but the obviously correct one. The combined force of the Eastern and Western field armies would be overwhelming. A concentration of Roman military power that the Gothic force could not hope to face in open battle. The campaign would likely be resolved before autumn, and both emperors would share the credit for the resolution. This was the calculation that Sebastian pressed when Valens convened his council of war at Adrianople in the first days of August 378. The council brought together the senior commanders of the Eastern Field Army, men whose collective experience of the Gothic campaign and of frontier warfare generally represented a deep reservoir of professional judgment, and the discussion that Ammianus reconstructs, drawing on testimony from survivors and participants, reveals a room in which the right answer was available and was articulated clearly, and was overruled. Sebastian argued for patience with the focused urgency of a man who had spent the previous year actually fighting the Goths, and understood their capabilities from direct experience. He had studied their cavalry. He had watched what happened when Roman infantry formations were caught in terrain that favored mounted forces. He understood that the Gothic force they were preparing to engage was not the diminished and desperate rabble that some of the optimists in the council were describing. Wait for Gratian, Sebastian urged. The delay cost nothing, and the combined force made success essentially certain. Against Sebastian's professional judgment stood the voices of the imperial court, the officials and advisors whose careers depended on reading the emperor's desires correctly and whose survival instinct pointed them reliably toward telling power what power wished to hear. They pointed to the intelligence reports. They pointed to Gratian's approaching army and asked, with the particular insinuation that court advisors deploy when they want to make a pragmatic argument feel like a principled one, whether the Emperor of Rome truly needed to share the resolution of his own frontier crisis with his teenage nephew. They pointed to the numbers. The numbers were the hinge on which everything turned. A Roman reconnaissance force had observed the Gothic encampment, a traditional wagon circle formation on a low ridge, approximately 9 miles north of Adrianople, and had returned with an estimate of the Gothic strength. Approximately 10,000 warriors, the scouts reported. Perhaps fewer. The report was almost certainly wrong. Anyone who had followed the Gothic crisis with close attention would have had reason to doubt it. The Gothic forces that had been operating across Thrace for 2 years represented a substantially larger population than 10,000 warriors. And the practice of establishing a wagon circle with the community's non-combatants inside while the cavalry ranged out foraging was standard Gothic operational procedure, meaning that a scout observing the wagon circle would systematically undercount the true strength by missing the cavalry entirely. The intelligence was not merely incomplete. It was structurally misleading in a way that careful analysis should have identified. But Valens wanted to believe it. 10,000 Gothic warriors against the Eastern Field Army, even without Gratian's reinforcement, meant a Roman numerical advantage of somewhere between 2 and 3 to 1. Depending on whose estimates of Roman strength one accepted, it meant a battle that was not merely winnable but already effectively won before it began. It meant, above all, that waiting for Gratian was unnecessary, and that the victory, when it came, would belong to Valens alone. The Council of War ended with the decision to march. On the morning of August 9, 378 AD, the Eastern Roman field army moved out of Adrianople and headed north across the Thracian plain toward the Gothic position 9 miles away. The march began in the early morning, before the full heat of an August day had established itself. But the column was long, the road was difficult, and the coordination between units that had been assembled from multiple garrison forces across the Eastern Empire was imperfect. By the time the lead elements of the Roman column approached the vicinity of the Gothic encampment, it was already past noon. The soldiers had been marching for 7 hours in the full heat of a Thracian August, wearing iron armor over wool tunics, carrying weapons and shields, and the accumulated equipment of a campaign army. They had eaten inadequately that morning and had drunk less water than 7 hours of summer marching in armor required. As the Roman force approached the ridge where the Gothic wagon circle was established, the Goths set fire to the dry grass of the surrounding fields. It was a deliberate tactical move, designed to add smoke and heat and disorientation to the difficulties already facing the Roman formation. The smoke drifted across the Roman lines, making it harder to see the ground ahead, harder to breathe, harder to assess what was happening beyond the immediate vicinity of each soldier's position in the formation. Through the smoke and the heat shimmer of the August afternoon, the Roman soldiers could hear the Gothic warriors on the ridge, singing their war songs, the sound rising and falling on the thick air. A noise that Ammianus describes as wild and discordant, carrying across the distance between the two forces with an unsettling clarity that the smoke made somehow worse. And then, from the Gothic encampment, came an embassy under a flag of truce. Fritigern wanted to negotiate, the ambassador said. There was still the possibility of a settlement that would spare both sides the cost of a battle. The Gothic leader was prepared to discuss terms if the emperor was willing to receive a proper embassy. He requested a senior Roman official of appropriate rank as a counterpart for the discussion. Valens agreed to receive the embassy and sent a junior officer in response. A decision that Fritigern found insulting, and that accomplished nothing diplomatically. More time passed. The sun moved across the sky. The Roman soldiers stood in their armor on the smoky plain and waited, their exhaustion deepening with every hour of inaction, their water supplies diminishing. Fritigern, behind the wagon circle, was buying time with the patience of a man who knew exactly what he was waiting for. What he was waiting for was his cavalry. The Gothic cavalry force, commanded by the leaders Alethius and Suffrax, had been out of the encampment when the Roman army arrived. Ranging through the countryside in the daily foraging that kept the Gothic community fed. There were thousands of horsemen, the most dangerous military asset the Gothic force possessed, and they were not on the field. Every hour of negotiation brought them closer. Then, without orders from any senior Roman commander, without the authorization of the emperor or the council of war, a unit of Roman auxiliary infantry on one flank broke from the line and advanced toward the Gothic position. The sources disagree on which flank moved and on the precise identity of the unit. And the honest answer is that the ancient testimony is not consistent enough to resolve the question definitively. What the sources agree on is the result. The unauthorized advance ended the negotiation, because it ended the possibility of negotiation. The battle had begun. At that moment, on the horizon beyond the Gothic wagon circle, a cloud of dust appeared. Out of it came the Gothic cavalry, thousands of horsemen returning from their foraging range. Taking in the tactical situation in the experienced instant of men who had spent their lives reading the landscape of warfare, and reacting with the speed that made them so devastatingly effective. The afternoon was about to become something that the survivors would spend the rest of their lives trying to find words adequate to describe. The Battle of Adrianople lasted a matter of hours, less time than it takes to cross a large city in heavy traffic, less time than the Roman army had spent marching to reach the battlefield that morning. And in those hours, compressed and catastrophic and irreversible, the world changed in ways that would take a century to fully manifest and 16 centuries to fully comprehend. The Gothic cavalry struck first, and where they struck determined everything that followed. The Roman formation, as it had been deployed across the Thracian plain in front of the Gothic wagon circle, had its flanks anchored by Roman cavalry units. The standard disposition of a Roman army preparing for a frontal engagement. The Roman infantry, the heart of the force and the bearer of 800 years of military tradition, was massed in the center. Its close formation and discipline advanced the instrument through which Roman armies had conquered and held an empire. The plan, to the degree that a plan existed for a battle that began without proper preparation or reconnaissance, was the plan that Roman armies had executed successfully for centuries: advance in formation, close with the enemy. Use the superior discipline and equipment of the Roman infantry to grind the opposing force into submission. The Gothic cavalry came from a direction and at a speed that the Roman deployment had not accounted for, sweeping in on the Roman flank. With the momentum of thousands of horsemen who had been covering ground at the gallop and arrived already in motion. Already committed. Already a force of nature rather than a military unit that could be responded to with deliberate tactical adjustment. The Roman cavalry on the exposed flank tried to turn and meet them. The accounts suggest they had almost no time to do so. The Gothic horsemen, large men on large horses, many of them equipped with the heavy armor that the wealthier Gothic warriors had acquired through decades of contact with Roman military equipment, hit the Roman cavalry before any coherent defensive formation could be established. The Roman cavalry broke. This single fact, more than any other, determined the outcome of the Battle of Adrianople. Roman cavalry had never been the decisive arm of the Roman military system. The Roman genius was in its infantry, in the discipline and cohesion of the legionary formation, in the ability of Roman soldiers to maintain their order under pressure that would dissolve less trained forces. Roman cavalry was always somewhat auxiliary, a force for screening and pursuit and exploitation rather than for the decisive shock of the main engagement. On this afternoon, already exhausted from the morning's march, surprised by the angle and speed of the Gothic cavalry's arrival, the Roman horsemen on the flank reached the limit of what they could do and passed beyond it. They turned their horses from the Gothic charge and left the field. Their departure exposed the right flank and then the rear of the Roman infantry formation. The Roman heavy infantry, those soldiers in their lorica segmentata armor with their large rectangular shields and their short stabbing swords, were the finest close-quarters fighters in the ancient world when they could fight the way they had been trained to fight. The Roman infantry system was built around formation, around the maintenance of the tight cohesion that converted individual soldiers into a collective instrument of irresistible pressure. In formation, with their flanks protected and their lines dressed and their officers in place, Roman infantry could absorb punishment that would break any other force and keep advancing. The system had been tested for centuries and had not failed. The system required certain conditions to function. It required space for the formation to maneuver. It required protected flanks. It required the ability of officers to maintain communication and control across the width of the line. It required soldiers who were physically capable of the enormous, sustained effort that close infantry combat demanded. On the afternoon of August 9, 378 AD, none of these conditions existed. The Gothic infantry pressed outward from the wagon circle simultaneously with the cavalry's action on the flanks, the two movements combining to create a compression of the Roman formation that the infantry's own density made catastrophic. As Gothic cavalry curled around the exposed Roman flank and began to press inward from behind, and as Gothic infantry pushed against the Roman front from the direction of the wagon circle, the Roman formation found itself being compressed from multiple directions at once. Men who had been fighting with room to swing a sword found the space around them shrinking as the pressure increased. Men in the second and third ranks of the formation, pressing forward to support the front, found that there was nowhere for the front to go. The Roman formation, designed to advance and push, began to fold inward on itself. Ammianus Marcellinus, in the passage of the Res Gestae that describes the battle, writes with the controlled horror of a man who has heard these accounts from people who were inside that formation and lived to describe it. He describes soldiers so tightly packed that they could not raise their arms to use their weapons. He describes men lifted off their feet by the pressure of bodies around them, carried forward or backward by the movement of the mass with no agency of their own. He describes the dead remaining upright because the density of the living around them left no room to fall, carried along in the formation until the whole structure finally gave way. The heat compounded everything. August in Thrace is not mild, and the men inside the collapsing Roman formation had been marching in iron armor since before dawn. They had sweated through their tunics before the fighting began. The physical effort of simply standing in the crush, of holding a shield up against the pressure of bodies and weapons, of maintaining any kind of position in a formation that was simultaneously being compressed from outside and collapsing from within, demanded resources of strength and endurance that these men had largely exhausted before the first Gothic horsemen appeared on the horizon. Ammianus suggests, and modern military historians have accepted the suggestion as physiologically plausible, that heat exhaustion contributed materially to the Roman collapse, that men who might have held their position in cooler conditions with fresher bodies reached the physical limit of what human endurance could sustain and went past it. The senior commanders died one after another, and with each commander who fell, the possibility of any coordinated response to the tactical situation diminished further. Traianus, who had commanded a significant portion of the Roman force, died in the press. Sebastian, who had argued so precisely and so futilely for caution at the Council of War, died. The tribunes who commanded individual units, men whose experience and authority were the mechanisms through which Roman military discipline functioned, died. Ammianus writes that of the senior officers who had ridden out of Adrianople that morning, only a handful survived to see the evening. The institutional memory of the Eastern Field Army, accumulated through decades of service and campaign, was being destroyed faster than anyone could register or respond to the loss. What had been an army became, in the space of an hour, a crowd. What had been a battle became, in the space of another hour, something that required a different word. Individual Roman units tried to hold together as the larger formation dissolved around them. Officers who had lost contact with the command structure attempted to maintain order among the men immediately around them, creating small islands of cohesion in the chaos. Some of these small units extracted themselves from the collapse and moved toward the edges of the battlefield, withdrawing in the organized fashion that Roman military training ingrained deeply enough to persist even in catastrophe. Others were surrounded before they could move and shared the fate of the larger formation they had been part of. The Roman cavalry that had fled the field at the beginning of the battle was not a factor in any of this. Some units rode off the battlefield entirely and did not stop until they reached Adrianople or beyond. Others dispersed into the Thracian countryside and made their way back to Roman lines individually over the days that followed, arriving in ones and twos, their testimony adding detail to the picture of what had happened but offering no military assistance at the moment it was needed. Emperor Valens fought in the line with his men. Roman emperors of the 4th century were expected to lead from the front, to be visibly present in the fighting, rather than commanding from a secure position in the rear, and Valens, whatever his failures of judgment in the decisions that had led to this battle, did not fail in this particular duty. He was wounded at some point in the fighting, the nature and severity of the wound unspecified in the sources, and when the formation around him began to collapse beyond any possibility of recovery, his surviving bodyguard decided to extract him from the main carnage. They brought him to a farmhouse. The stone building stood near the edge of the battlefield, a solid provincial structure of the kind built to last. The kind of building whose walls would still be standing centuries after whoever built it had been forgotten. The emperor's bodyguard brought him inside and prepared to defend the position. Roman soldiers appeared at the upper windows. When Gothic warriors approached, they were met with missile fire from above, and the cost of a direct assault was high enough to give the Goths pause. The Goths did not know who was in the building. They knew that someone was defending it with enough determination to make taking it by force expensive. And they made the calculation that any military force makes when faced with a defended position that can be neutralized without a direct assault. They gathered wood and brush from the farmyard and the surrounding area. They piled it against the stone walls of the building. They set it on fire. The building burned. The men inside burned with it. One man escaped. The sources name him variously or not at all, but Ammianus preserves the tradition that a single attendant or court official lowered himself from a window before the fire had fully taken hold and was captured by the Gothic warriors outside. The Goths questioned him. He told them, when they asked why the building had been defended so fiercely, who had been inside. The reaction of the Gothic warriors who heard his answer is not recorded. They had killed the Emperor of Rome without knowing they were doing it, and the news of what they had accomplished reached the wider Gothic leadership and eventually the Roman world through this chain of transmission. Testimony from a single survivor of a burning building on the edge of a field in Thrace. The body of Flavius Valens, Emperor of the Roman East for 14 years, was never found. The fire had done its work too thoroughly, or the chaos of the battlefield aftermath had made identification among the thousands of Roman dead impossible. Roman officials who came to the site in the days following the battle found the ruins of the farmhouse. They did not find the emperor. On the Thracian plain, as the sun went down on August 9, 378 AD, the silence that Ammianus says the survivors always remembered was settling over a landscape that had held, that morning, the full strength of Rome's eastern field army. The Gothic encampments were lighting their fires against the evening chill. The road south to Adrianople was carrying the men who had gotten out, moving as quickly as exhaustion allowed. Carrying with them the knowledge of what they had seen and the weight of what they would have to say when they arrived. Somewhere behind them, in the ruins of a farmhouse on a plain that would forget what had happened there long before history did, the most powerful man in the Eastern world had returned to the earth. Without ceremony, without a name on stone, without anything at all to mark that he had been. The morning after Adrianople was quiet in the way that only certain places can be quiet. A silence that pressed against those who heard it with the specific weight of an absence too large to process all at once. The Gothic forces did not pursue the retreating Romans with the kind of organized, sustained aggression that might have destroyed what remained of the Eastern Field Army as a functioning unit. This was not mercy, and it was not strategic confusion. It was the reality of what the Gothic Confederation was and what it was not. The Goths had won a staggering military victory, but they were not a conquest army in the Roman sense. A force with the logistical infrastructure to sustain rapid deep advances into enemy territory, to hold what it took, to convert military success into territorial control. They had hundreds of thousands of non-combatant community members who needed to be fed and protected. Fritigern, reading the situation with the political intelligence that had defined his leadership throughout, understood that winning the battle was one achievement and winning the peace was an entirely different and far more difficult one. But if the Goths were not immediately marching on Constantinople, the city itself did not know that. The news of Adrianople reached Constantinople within days, carried by survivors riding whatever horses they could find along the Via Militaris, the great military road of the Balkans. The reaction in the city was, by every ancient account, one of genuine mass panic. Constantinople in 378 AD was already one of the largest cities in the Mediterranean world, a dense and diverse urban environment of merchants and administrators and clergy and soldiers. And the simply desperate, people drawn from every corner of the empire by the opportunities and the energy of a city that had been growing rapidly for half a century since Constantine had made it his capital. These people now learned simultaneously that the army standing between them and the Gothic force had effectively ceased to exist, that the emperor was dead or missing, and that no replacement for either the man or the soldiers was immediately available. The streets filled with rumors of a kind that only cities under genuine existential threat generate, rumors that feed on themselves, that grow with each retelling, that convert uncertainty into the specific terror of imminent catastrophe. Gothic soldiers were already at the walls. The walls would not hold. Help was too far away to arrive in time. Ammianus, writing with the precision of a man who understood urban panic from direct experience, describes the mood in Constantinople in the days immediately following Adrianople as bordering on collective breakdown. The city's remaining garrison forces barely sufficient to maintain basic order among a civilian population that had lost its confidence in the system's ability to protect them. There were people of Gothic origin in Constantinople itself, men who had come to the city as traders, as servants, as members of the Roman military establishment. In the years before the crisis, their presence in the city, a routine consequence of the long and complicated relationship between the Gothic world and the Roman one. In the panic that followed Adrianople, these men were rounded up. Some were imprisoned, some were killed by mobs before any official action could contain the violence. The city was turning on anyone who could be connected, however distantly or unfairly, to the force that had just destroyed its army. What prevented the panic from becoming something irreversibly catastrophic was a combination of the city's physical strength. Its walls were among the most formidable defensive works in the ancient world. The organizational competence of the city's administrative officials who kept the food supply moving and the essential functions of government operating during the crisis. Weeks, and the speed with which the Western Empire responded to the emergency. Gratian, 18 years old and in the middle of his own Balkan campaign when the news reached him, moved with a decisiveness that his uncle had failed to show in the months before Adrianople. He understood immediately that the loss of Valens created a political vacuum in the East that could not be allowed to persist. A Roman world divided into West and East required two emperors, and the East now had none. Gratian needed a colleague, someone he could trust with the enormous and immediately urgent task of rebuilding the Eastern military and managing the Gothic crisis that Adrianople had left unresolved and more dangerous than before. His choice was a Spanish-born Roman military officer named Theodosius, the son of a successful general who had been executed a few years earlier under circumstances that remained somewhat opaque, but that had apparently not attached a permanent political stigma to the family name. Theodosius was approximately 32 years old at the time of his selection. Experienced in frontier warfare, of unquestioned military competence, and without the existing power base or political network that might make him a threat to Gratian's own position. On January 19, 379 AD, at the city of Sirmium in the Balkan provinces, Gratian proclaimed Theodosius Emperor of the East. The appointment was one of the more consequential personnel decisions in Roman history. The man Gratian had chosen would prove to be exactly the combination of military competence, political flexibility, and strategic patience that the catastrophe of Adrianople demanded. Theodosius inherited a situation that, by any objective assessment, was extremely difficult. The Eastern Field Army had been destroyed. The Balkan provinces were devastated, their agricultural productivity disrupted, their civilian population displaced, and their infrastructure of roads and bridges and garrisons damaged by 2 years of Gothic raiding and the chaos of the aftermath of the battle. The tax revenues that funded the army were reduced precisely because the army was no longer present to enforce the conditions that made tax collection possible. And the Gothic force was still there, still armed, still led by Fritigern with the patience of a man who had learned not to hurry. Theodosius rebuilt with the methodical determination of a professional who understood that spectacular gestures were less valuable than structural restoration. He recruited aggressively from every available source Roman citizens, barbarian volunteers, and Gothic individuals willing to serve in Roman formations, drawing in soldiers wherever they could be found and organizing them into units that could function. He avoided pitched battles during the period when his rebuilt force was too raw and too small to risk a major engagement. relying instead on fortification and harassment and the slow reassertion of Roman presence across the Balkan road network. He negotiated where negotiation could buy time or extract concessions, and he fought where fighting could be done with manageable risk. Over the course of 3 years of patient, unglamorous work, he stabilized a situation that had seemed, in the autumn of 378, to be beyond stabilization. But there was a limit that military reconstruction alone could not overcome, and Theodosius was clear-eyed enough to see it. The Goths were not going to leave. There were too many of them, embedded too deeply in the fabric of the Balkan provinces, for any realistic military force. To expel them from Roman territory by direct application of violence. The choice was not between a Gothic presence and its absence. The choice was between a Gothic presence that could be made workable and one that could not. On October 3, 382 AD, 4 years after the battle that had created the crisis, Theodosius concluded a formal treaty with the Gothic leadership that was unlike any agreement Rome had previously made with a foreign people settling within its borders. The structure of the treaty was straightforward, and its implications were revolutionary. The Gothic people would settle permanently in the province of Moesia, in the territory of what is now northern Bulgaria, along the south bank of the Danube. They would maintain their own laws and their own internal governance under their own leaders, rather than being administered by Roman provincial authorities. They would be exempt from the standard Roman tax obligations. In exchange, they would provide military contingents to Rome when called upon. But those contingents would fight under Gothic commanders rather than being integrated into the Roman chain of command in the way that previous barbarian recruits had been absorbed. Rome had settled foreign peoples within its borders before. The practice of establishing barbarian groups as federates, allied communities with treaty obligations to provide military service, had a long history in Roman frontier policy. But the previous arrangements had always contained, at least as a theoretical principle, the expectation of eventual integration. The gradual absorption of the foreign community into the Roman social and legal framework over time. The slow erosion of separate identity as generations passed and Roman culture did its usual work of assimilation. The Treaty of 382 AD contained no such expectation. It recognized a permanent, self-governing Gothic political entity within Roman territory. A community that would remain Gothic indefinitely, subject to Roman authority in the broad sense of acknowledging the emperor's sovereignty while being effectively autonomous in everything that mattered to daily life. An empire had been created inside an empire. The precedent, once established, would be followed again and again. The military consequences of Adrianople were as profound as the political ones, though they took longer to fully manifest. What the battle had demonstrated, with the brutal clarity of an experiment conducted at enormous human cost, was something that military thinkers had been approaching through theoretical channels for decades. The era of the Roman heavy infantry legion as the primary decisive instrument of ancient warfare was over. Not diminished, not challenged, over. Heavy cavalry, the kind of mounted shock force that the Gothic horsemen had used to devastating effect on the Roman flanks, was the military future. The mounted warrior, heavily armored, operating with the tactical flexibility that infantry formations could never match. Dominating the open ground that infantry needed to fight effectively, was what the next 1,000 years of European warfare would be built around. The knight of medieval Europe, the central figure of feudal military culture, the armored horseman whose social and military role would define the European Middle Ages, was not born at Adrianople in any simple or direct sense. Military change does not work that way. But the tactical demonstration of August 9, 378 AD, accelerated a transformation that was already underway, and pointed toward what was coming with an unmistakable clarity that every serious military thinker in the post-Adrianople generation had to engage with. Within a generation of the battle, the Roman army itself was restructuring around cavalry, recruiting from peoples whose horsemanship was their primary military identity, revising tactical doctrine in ways that reflected the lesson the Goths had taught on the Thracian plain. The Rome that emerged from Adrianople was recognizably Roman in its laws, its language, its administrative structures, and its self-understanding. But it was dependent on non-Roman peoples for its military survival in ways that would have been unthinkable to the Rome of 2 centuries earlier. And it was increasingly willing to accommodate permanent separate communities within its borders rather than insisting on absorption. And it was losing, slowly but unmistakably, the comprehensive political authority that had once been its most fundamental characteristic. 28 years after Adrianople, in 410 AD, the Visigothic king Alaric led his people into Italy and sacked the city of Rome. The Gothic community that had crossed the Danube as refugees in 376 AD, that had been exploited and humiliated and driven to rebellion by the corruption of Lupicinus and Maximus, had become, within a single generation, the force that accomplished what no foreign enemy had managed in 800 years. The psychological shock to the Roman world was enormous, out of all proportion to the actual physical damage, which was real but not catastrophic. What the sack of Rome in 410 AD represented was the completion of a trajectory that had begun on the banks of the Danube in 376. The demonstration that the process set in motion by the Gothic crossing had reached its logical conclusion. 66 years after Adrianople, in 476 AD, a Germanic chieftain named Odoacer, of Syrian descent, and the commander of a mixed force of Germanic troops in Roman service, deposed the last Western emperor, the boy Romulus Augustulus. Odoacer did not proclaim himself emperor. He did not replace the Roman system with a Gothic or Germanic alternative. He ruled Italy as its king, using the administrative apparatus that Rome had built, governing a population that remained Roman in language and law and self-understanding, and sent the Western imperial regalia to Constantinople with a message explaining that the West no longer required a separate emperor. That one was sufficient for the whole. The Eastern Empire did not fall. Constantinople endured, adapting and contracting and sometimes expanding, maintaining the Roman tradition in a form that became increasingly Greek and increasingly Byzantine, surviving the pressure of Persians and Arabs, and Turks for 1,000 years after Adrianople, until Ottoman cannon finally brought down its walls in 1453. But the Western world that Rome had built was gone, replaced by something new that was made partly of Roman material, and partly of the Gothic and Germanic and Hunnic energy that Rome had tried to manage and failed to contain. The medieval world that came after was the child of both, and it was born, in a real and traceable sense, on the afternoon of August 9, 378 AD, on a plain in Thrace where an emperor disappeared into smoke and left nothing behind. There is a particular kind of tragedy that belongs not to individuals, but to systems, the slow failure of something that worked for so long and so well that the people inside it could not imagine it failing until the moment it did. Flavius Valens was not a great emperor. History has considered his reign carefully and arrived at a verdict that is difficult to argue with on the evidence. He was theologically rigid to the point of cruelty, pursuing the Arian controversy with a relentlessness that divided communities and generated genuine suffering across the eastern provinces. He was sensitive to his own reputation to a degree that, in the final crisis of his reign, overrode the professional judgment of men who understood the military situation better than he did. The decision to march on August 9, without Gratian's reinforcement, based on a scout report that should have been questioned more carefully, with an army that had not slept or eaten properly, is a decision that is very hard to defend on any military grounds. He made it, and he died for it, and 20,000 or more of his soldiers died for it with him. Their names unrecorded, their fates folded into the aggregate of the catastrophe that his choices produced. But Valens alone did not create Adrianople. He inherited a system that had been accumulating structural failures for generations. And the weight of those accumulated failures came down, as such weights always do, on the people at the bottom who had the least ability to resist or redirect them. Lupicinus and Maximus, the officials who had turned the Gothic crossing into a personal commercial enterprise and created the conditions for the rebellion that killed 20,000 Roman soldiers, were not aberrations. They were products of a late Roman administrative culture that had learned to prioritize personal enrichment over public function, that had developed sophisticated mechanisms for extracting wealth from positions of authority while maintaining the external forms of legitimate governance. The corruption that destroyed the Gothic crossing arrangement was systemic, not individual. The court officials who told Valens what he wanted to hear at the Council of War were doing what court officials in every human civilization have always done, which is to survive by telling power what power wishes to believe. The institutional machinery that should have corrected the false scout report, that should have insisted on Gratian's reinforcement, that should have overruled the emperor's pride with the emperor's strategic interest, failed because it had been shaped, over years of Valens's reign, into an instrument that amplified the emperor's existing inclinations rather than challenging them. The men who died in the press of bodies on the Thracian plain were the final recipients of all these accumulated failures. They had done nothing wrong. They had marched when ordered to march, formed up when ordered to form up, and fought when ordered to fight and died when the situation demanded it. Which is what soldiers have always done throughout all of human history. Their names, with a handful of exceptions preserved by Ammianus's meticulous record-keeping, are not written anywhere. What is written is the world they left behind, and the world that remade itself in the absence of everything they had represented. Fritigern, who had brought his people from the banks of the Danube to the Treaty of 382 AD, who had converted a community of desperate refugees into a political entity with permanent recognition inside Roman borders, disappears from the historical record shortly after the treaty was concluded. We do not know when he died or how he had accomplished what he set out to accomplish when he crossed the Danube. Survival and security for his people, and the sources that had tracked him closely through the crisis years of 376 to 382 apparently found nothing further to record. He remains one of the most consequential political leaders of the late antique world and one of its least known, a man whose name most educated people today have never encountered, who changed the shape of European history more fundamentally than most people whose names fill textbooks. The Goths who settled in Moesia under the terms of the 382 treaty did not become Romans. They lived inside the empire, fought for the empire. Their leaders acquired Roman titles and Roman administrative skills, and learned to navigate Roman political culture with increasing sophistication. But they remained Goths. They maintained their language, their traditions, their Gothic Christianity, and their loyalty to their own leadership, rather than to the abstract imperial authority. When the political conditions of the early 5th century shifted, when the Western imperial system began to fracture under pressures that Adrianople had set in motion. The Goths acted in accordance with their own interests and their own identity, as they had always done. In 410 AD, Alaric sacked Rome. In 476 AD, Odoacer ended the Western Empire. In the kingdoms that emerged from the wreckage of the Roman West, Gothic and Frankish and Lombard and Visigothic rulers governed populations that were still Roman in culture and law. Using administrative systems that Rome had built, on land that Rome had organized, in cities that Rome had founded. The barbarian kingdoms of the early Middle Ages did not cause the destruction of Rome. They were its transformation, and the Gothic crossing of the Danube in 376 AD, and the Battle of Adrianople 2 years later, were the hinge on which that transformation turned. Ammianus Marcellinus, who gave us the most detailed and reliable account we have of these events, ended his great history with the Battle of Adrianople. He had begun his history where Tacitus had ended his, and he had intended to carry the story further, but Adrianople seemed to him a natural stopping point. A place where the narrative of one kind of world gave way to something that required a different kind of telling. He understood, more clearly than most of his contemporaries, what the afternoon of August 9, 378 AD had actually been. Not merely a military defeat, not merely a political crisis, but a demonstration that the system of the world as the ancient Mediterranean had understood it for 8 centuries was capable of breaking in ways it could not repair. He was right, and the world that broke on that plain, and the world that assembled itself from the pieces over the following century, is the world whose inheritance we still carry in our laws, and our institutions and our military traditions and our complicated, layered understanding of what civilization means, and what it costs and what it owes to the people who live inside it. Somewhere on the plain outside the city that was once Adrianople and is now Edirne, in the northwestern corner of modern Turkey. On ground that has been farmed and built upon and walked across by 40 generations of people who knew nothing of what happened there, the farmhouse burned. The Emperor of Rome returned to the earth without ceremony. The silence settled over the Thracian plain, and the medieval world, with everything it would become, took its first breath. Remember the date. August 9, 378 AD, the afternoon that ended the ancient world, not with a dramatic final battle, not with the fall of a great city, not with a single moment of obvious catastrophe that everyone present recognized as definitive, with a farmhouse fire on a summer evening in Thrace, with a body that was never found, with a silence that the survivors never forgot, and that 16 centuries of history have never fully broken.